Hey friends, welcome back. Or if you're here for the first time, I'm glad you found your way. Let's get straight into it. In the stillness of a torchlit corridor beneath the apostolic palace, a lone candle sputtered in its holder, its weak flame trembling against the weight of centuries. Shadows stretched and twisted across frescoed walls and ancient stonework, as if the very past leaned in to witness the present. The air was thick with incense, and with it came the scent of old secrets, of prayers whispered into cold marble, of time looping back on itself. Far above, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica had long since finished tolling for Vespers. But in the silent and secretive arteries of the Vatican, a new kind of vigil had taken root. It was the bitter winter of 1276, and for the third time in a single calendar year, the throne of St. Peter sat eerily empty. But before we wander further into this strange, nearly forgotten moment in the history of the Church, I ask you to pause and support this journey. Tap the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether you're resting in a quiet apartment or tuning in from a countryside road, it's always remarkable to see how these echoes from the past ripple across the present. A lone figure moved deliberately past the imposing bronze doors of the papal apartments, his movements softened by the layer of straw rushes beneath his boots. He carried no scroll, no commands, no formal dispatch, only an air of quiet purpose. Outside, the guards had not been rotated. Inside, the hush was not the reverent quiet of ritual, but the brittle silence of confusion. The papal apartments, once sacred and commanding, now felt like a stage abandoned mid-performance. The last pope, first Gregory X, followed quickly by Innocent V, and more recently Adrian V, was no longer among them. Not taken by death, nor exiled or removed by ecclesiastical decree. Simply gone. There had been no thunderous proclamation, no ringing of the conclave bell, no papal bull with gilded seal declaring resignation or death. The keys of the kingdom, both spiritual and symbolic, had not passed to any new hands. During the darkest hours of night, the Pope had disappeared, and with his vanishing, the precarious scaffolding that held together a deeply divided church began to wobble. Outside the Vatican, the Roman countryside continued on in its gray and indifferent slumber. Peasants led flocks along frozen fields, smoke curled from monastery chimneys, and pilgrims made their slow, weary way toward shrines, blissfully unaware of the silent unraveling unfolding just beyond view. Within churches across the city, Mass was performed as usual, Latin prayers rising to the vaulted ceilings, incense winding toward stone domes. But in the epicenter of Catholic power, the air had changed. The pulse had slowed. The whispers began softly, as all dangerous things do. Some claimed the Pope had been seized in the night by those envious of his authority. Others swore he had fled in fear, broken by the immense pressures of rule, either from within the Vatican's murky politics or from divine revelation, too terrifying to bear. A handful dared to murmur that he had secretly rejected the faith, but most kept these speculations locked behind their teeth, knowing that in Rome a wrong word could echo longer than any prayer. In the richly decorated meeting halls of the College of Cardinals, anxiety rippled behind measured expressions. Already fractured by tensions between French and Italian factions, the college treaded carefully. Their conversations were restrained, alliances fluid. Should word of the Pope's unexplained absence escape these walls, the consequences could be catastrophic. Ambitious kings, Charles of Anjou to the south in Naples, Rudolph of Habsburg rising in the north, might interpret it as an opportunity to seize spiritual dominance. The people of Rome, long accustomed to chaos, might again rise in fury or fear, but beneath all the layered suspicions and maneuverings, one quiet, unyielding truth settled over the Vatican like frost. There was no pope. Outside the locked doors of the Vatican Library, a young scribe sat at a massive oak desk, his quill poised above blank parchment. He had come prepared to transcribe a homily. Instead, he was confronted with the task of chronicling silence. With a shaking hand, he etched a single, solemn line. Vacante sede apostolica. The apostolic see is vacant. The pages that followed would not speak of miracles or sermons or theological triumphs. They would detail absence, a void where divine authority should dwell, a hush where once had been certainty. The day progressed, but the Holy See remained mute. There were no addresses from the balcony, no proclamations in the square, no signs of leadership. The windows stayed shuttered. The doors to St. Peter's remained firmly closed. And inside, a tectonic shift occurred, not marked by blood or banners, but by the quiet withdrawal of presence itself. And so, the world turned, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge that something had slipped out of place at the very heart of Christendom. And within the walls of the Vatican, men waited, not for resurrection, but for instruction, for clarity, for meaning. And the day passed, still unanswered. As dawn broke over the 7 hills of Rome, a pale golden light spilled slowly across the cobblestones and crumbling mosaics of a city steeped in centuries of glory, war, and spiritual command. A city now cloaked in eerie quiet. Outside the fortified walls of the Vatican, Rome stirred to life with the sluggish rhythm of a midwinter morning. Vendors shivered beside smoldering braziers as they arranged yesterday's bread on wooden carts. Friars, hunched in thick woolen cloaks, moved briskly through narrow alleys, their sandals echoing against the frost-slick stones. Nobles, cloistered in aging villas, peered through frost-fogged windows at a world they still claimed to rule in title, though the spirit of their dominion had grown hollow. Yet within the Vatican, where the world had for centuries looked for constancy, faith, and command, there was no sign of mourning. No bells rang to greet the day. No murmured prayers from the Sistine Chapel drifted into the corridors. No echo of clerical heels on marble. The heart of Catholicism had fallen mute. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the papal chamber stood precisely as it had the night before. A heavy silence blanketed the room. On a small carved table beside the bed, a silver chalice sat half full of wine, now turned sour. A missal lay open to the readings for Epiphany, untouched and already dusted at the edges. The Pope's slippers, finely embroidered, rested neatly beside the ornate canopy bed. Against the wall leaned the crozier, polished and upright, the staff of a shepherd whose flock no longer knew where he was. The throne of Peter was unoccupied, and worse, unaccounted for. No resignation, no message, no witness to his final movements. It was as though the pontiff had dissolved into air. By mid-morning, the College of Cardinals had assembled in a marble hall warmed only by weak winter sunlight filtering through high stained glass windows. Their expressions were somber, their breath misting slightly in the cold. No hymns accompanied them. No official edict had been issued, but each knew instinctively that something beyond precedent had occurred. There was no rule book for vanishing pontiffs. Canon law allowed for abdication, but only through formal declaration. No such declaration had been made, and within the huddled discussions and wary glances, political tensions simmered. Cardinals from Anagni, Florence, Avignon, and Genoa exchanged veiled remarks. The French faction, heavily influenced by Charles of Anjou's ambitions, pushed for swift action. The Italian delegation, loyal to Roman tradition and wary of foreign influence, urged caution. Outside the Vatican walls, the city's undercurrent of superstition and rumor began to surge. Rome's citizens, always alert to omens and portents, whispered their theories in marketplaces and taverns. A baker in Trastevere insisted he had seen a hooded man in white robes boarding a boat on the Tiber before dawn. A washerwoman claimed the chapel bells had rung 3 times during the dead of night, No ordinary toll, she swore, but a harbinger of spiritual upheaval. Pilgrims, some barefoot and weeping, arrived at the gates of St. Peter's only to find the doors shut. The basilica, that eternal mouth of prayer and proclamation, remained closed. Priests gave gentle, practiced reassurances. But there was little they could offer beyond a liturgy of vague hope. The silence itself became suspect. By nightfall, torchlight returned to the Vatican's long corridors, not for ceremony but for secretive motion. Swift messengers, monks in plain cloaks, and clerics with sealed letters were dispatched under the guise of night. Their destinations varied: distant abbots, key bishops, kings whose loyalty to Rome was measured in both piety and politics. The letters contained no orders, only questions. Have you seen him? Have you heard anything? Is there news? The language was careful, diplomatic. For how did one admit uncertainty from the seat of divine authority? In the Curia, where ancient wall hangings stirred in unseen drafts, and tapestries of saints and sinners watched with embroidered eyes, the unease deepened. Candles sputtered in the chill, casting elongated shadows along the stone floors. The very air seemed to throb with the weight of unspoken fear. And among the clergy, men trained to wield certainty like a sword, a single gnawing question took root. If the vicar of Christ could vanish without trace, without martyrdom or miracle, what then became of the church's unbroken line? What did this mean for the authority of the keys passed from Peter? What did this silence say about God's will? That night, wind howled through the bones of ancient buildings. Wolves were heard on the distant hills closer than usual. St. Peter's Basilica remained dark. Its bells hung still in their towers, wrapped in a hush thicker than snow. And in that silence, something shifted. A threshold had been crossed, not by decree or invasion, but by absence. A church, once unified in voice and vision, stood on the brink of an uncertain dawn. The night passed in bitter silence. Rome, ancient and unknowable, slept fitfully under a moon partially veiled by wisps of cloud. As the hours crawled by, the city's old stones seemed to hold their breath, and even the usual clatter of carts and cries of vendors fell strangely quiet. And when morning crept back into the streets, soft and gray and unhurried, the void left behind in the Vatican had begun to spread, subtle and invisible, yet already reshaping the rhythms of faith and authority. The news had not yet been formally declared, but something was wrong, and the city knew it. In churches throughout Rome, early morning mass began with a tremor of hesitation. Priests paused longer than usual before opening their missals. Choirs sang quieter than normal, uncertain whether to raise their voices or to mute them. At Santa Maria in Trastevere, a deacon fumbled the reading of the gospel, and the congregation stared not at him, but at the empty space behind the altar, where a cardinal was expected but never arrived. Whispers followed parishioners out into the chilly morning air, where incense clung to their cloaks and anxiety sharpened their breath. They murmured theories, each more improbable than the last, and yet each more believable, simply because nothing else made sense. The pontifical Swiss Guard, normally ceremonial in appearance, now stood rigid at key points along the Vatican perimeter. Their halberds were not just ornamental today, they gripped them with purpose. Behind closed doors, their commanders discussed protocols that had not been revisited in generations. What if the Pope had fled? What if he had been abducted, or worse? Could it have been illness? A secret pilgrimage? Even an assassination? None of the possibilities explained the sheer absence. No witnesses, no travel papers, no summons for doctors or confessors. Not even the night porter recalled hearing a door open. The papal apartments had been found exactly as they had always been, undisturbed and untouched, as if the Holy Father had merely stepped out and forgotten to return. His sandals remained neatly aligned at the foot of his bed. The candle on his writing desk had burned down to a waxy stub. A parchment lay unfolded, midway through a sentence, as if interrupted only moments before. In the chambers of the Curia, debates grew tense. Theologians, canon lawyers, and archivists pored over centuries of precedent, searching for guidance in scrolls and illuminated codices. No pope in living memory had vanished. A few had abdicated. Others had died in secret or exile. But always there had been a trail, a letter, a death mask, a final blessing. But this was a vacuum, and into it rushed not understanding but panic. The sheer uncertainty was corrosive, peeling away assumptions layer by layer until only dread remained. Outside the Vatican, the city buzzed. Markets brimmed with speculation. A sculptor swore the Pope had entered his workshop 3 days prior and purchased a length of rope, not for binding, but for climbing. A tavern near the Tiber claimed the pontiff had been seen without his mitre, traveling incognito in simple monk's robes. Children repeated exaggerated tales overheard from drunken parents. Even the pigeons around St. Peter's Square seemed disoriented, flying in jagged patterns above the obelisk, as if responding to some unseen imbalance in the order of things. In diplomatic circles, uncertainty festered. Ambassadors from the Holy Roman Empire, France, and England sent urgent dispatches to their respective courts. The absence of the Pope was not merely a spiritual crisis. It was a geopolitical one. Without a pope, alliances became unstable. Crusading efforts lost central direction, and monarchs who had vied for papal favor now found themselves free to assert unchecked ambition. Treaties hung in limbo. Disputes long held in check by the Pope's signature began to simmer anew. By late afternoon, a message arrived from Avignon. The French court, ever calculating, proposed an emergency conclave. For stability, the note read, and the dignity of the chair of Peter. But others, especially the Roman cardinals, saw this as opportunism thinly veiled. Rumors swirled that Charles of Anjou himself was backing a candidate, perhaps even pressuring certain clergy through gifts and veiled threats. Tensions flared. The unity of the church began to splinter, not from external heresy, but from within. Back within the Vatican, a different anxiety grew. The faithful had begun to gather at the gates, more each hour. Pilgrims who had journeyed across Europe to receive a papal blessing now wept openly, pressing rosaries to the cold iron bars. Local priests tried to reassure them, offering general prayers and vague comfort. But even their words faltered. Without the Pope, who held the authority to grant absolution? Who could anoint, ordain, or excommunicate? These questions, once academic, now became immediate, real, and personal. Spiritual guidance gave way to confusion. As darkness fell once again, torches flickered along the walls of the Leonine city. The Sistine Chapel remained closed. The Apostolic Library locked. Cardinals met in whispered consultation, forming informal factions. The seat of divine authority was empty, and in that emptiness, fear took root. Not the fear of a conqueror's sword, but of a world slipping quietly from its axis. A church built on continuity now faced an uncertain breach in the chain, a crack in the very stone on which it claimed to be founded. The question on every tongue was the same. Where had the Holy Father gone? But beneath that question lay a deeper, more terrifying thought. What if he had not gone anywhere at all? What if this silence, this disappearance, was not a mystery to be solved, but a verdict rendered? And if so, by whom? By the second day, the mood in Rome had deepened into a strange and haunting stillness. What had begun as stunned disbelief now settled into a fog of unease that coiled around every chapel, cloister, and corridor of Vatican influence. The absence of the Pope no longer felt like an interruption. It was becoming a condition, a tension humming low in the bones of the city. Where the first morning had carried the breathless quiet of disbelief, the next delivered questions that pressed in from all sides, relentless and without easy answers. The Vatican remained immobile, wrapped in its own silence. No clarifying statement, No bulletin from the Holy See, not even the flicker of rumor with any authority behind it. The papal apartments stood dark, curtains drawn. Within St. Peter's Square, the usual throngs of pilgrims gave way to smaller clusters, some kneeling, others pacing. They lit candles, murmured rosaries, and waited as if stillness might coax an answer from heaven. Inside the apostolic palace, the College of Cardinals convened, not yet in conclave, but dangerously close. They gathered in frescoed chambers where the scent of incense still clung faintly to the walls. The scarlet robes of dozens of men rustled as they sat, bent over parchment maps and canonical texts, eyes flicking toward one another in quiet calculation. Tradition told them to wait, to proceed with care. But the pressure to act was building. There were whispered debates about invoking sede vacante, the declaration of an empty throne. Yet to do so, without clear evidence of the pontiff's death or resignation, would shatter precedent. It would be bold, it would be divisive, and still, paralysis threatened to be worse. On the streets, devotion took on a desperate edge. Vigils bloomed outside basilicas and shrines, clusters of candles glowing like constellations beneath the Roman sky. Mass was still celebrated, hymns were still sung, but something felt vacant within the liturgy, like words recited from memory, but emptied of meaning. Without the shepherd, the flock wavered. Was the Mass still valid if the earthly vicar of Christ had vanished without sacrament or ceremony? Some whispered that perhaps the very machinery of grace had stalled. In dimly lit monasteries, the old whispered to the young. Ancient apocryphal texts came up in hushed tones, forgotten manuscripts that spoke of popes lost to mystical raptures or secret ascensions. One friar cited a 13th century scroll, sealed long ago within Vatican vaults, which predicted a pontiff who would vanish without a trace and usher in an age of spiritual reckoning. The friar was silenced by superiors almost immediately, but not before his tale had made its way through kitchens and cloisters, passed between novices like contraband. Beyond Rome, the secular world moved swiftly. The vacuum of papal authority sparked opportunities. In the royal courts of Europe, advisors huddled around maps and treaties, calculating moves long held in check by ecclesiastical boundaries. A minor German prince declared his intent to marry without papal approval, an act once unthinkable, now a bold statement of defiance. In Spain, land disputes once tangled in papal arbitration were resolved with swords, not scrolls. In Florence, a young scholar, part philosopher, part agitator, stood before a university hall and gave a lecture titled "The Mortal Church." He questioned whether the divine truly resided in a single man in white, or if it lived instead in the community of the faithful. Applause followed, but so did warnings from bishops. In Paris, barefoot preachers cried that this was divine punishment for Rome's sins. Their arrests only amplified their sermons. At Castel San Angelo, soldiers prepared without overt declaration. The Swiss Guard and Roman militias subtly increased patrols. The city had not yet descended into chaos, but tension whispered in every alley. Pilgrims refused to leave. Merchants argued more loudly than usual. In coffeehouses and marketplaces, theories abounded. Abduction, prophecy, martyrdom, even celestial intervention. Meanwhile, the papal apartments remained untouched. Layers of dust gathered on windowsills. The parchment at the writing desk, still bearing an unfinished sentence, lay where it had been. One servant, perhaps weary, perhaps defiant, stepped inside to light a single candle before retreating in silence. Its flame danced across the stone walls, casting trembling shadows over the space that once held the voice of Christendom. No one dared speak of succession openly, not yet. But in the deepest chambers of the Curia, the question was no longer if, but when. If the Pope did not return, someone else would have to rise, not just to lead, but to keep the church from unraveling into quiet chaos. That unraveling had already begun to creep, soft-footed, silent, persistent. Outside, the city of Rome tried again to sleep. The skies remained colorless, clouded, heavy. Bells rang their regular patterns, but even they sounded different. Thinner, hollow, as if waiting like everyone else for a sign that the world had not truly changed. By the third day, the air in Rome had grown heavy, not merely with the clinging heat of late summer, but with a weight far more intangible and ominous. It was the weight of uncertainty, of dread wrapped in routine, soaked into the cobblestones and echoing from the high walls of the Vatican. The tension was not loud. It did not manifest in sirens or cries, but in slow, deliberate steps, in glances that lingered a moment too long, in the silences that deepened with each passing hour. The usual calm of the Vatican had grown oppressive, not with reverence, but with a kind of suffocating expectation, as if everyone, from the cardinals to the cleaning staff, knew something was wrong, but could not bring themselves to say it aloud. In St. Peter's Square, the usual crowds had thinned, but not dispersed. Pilgrims and the devout remained, rooted like shadows among the towering colonnades. Some clutched rosaries that had warmed to the temperature of their palms, mouthing prayers with the mechanical devotion of exhaustion. Others held signs, desperate, hand-written pleas for answers. Eyes often drifted upward to the empty papal window, hoping, praying, for the twitch of a curtain, the flicker of candlelight, any movement at all to break the stillness. On the wide marble steps, people gathered in quiet clusters, reciting the litany of the saints, not in triumph, but in weary, tremulous hope. Faith remained, but it was changing, becoming less like a flame and more like the last warmth of coals beneath ash. Within the sacred corridors of the Vatican, the institution still stood. The machinery of the church continued to move, but faltered, like a clock that ticks on just off beat. Meetings among the College of Cardinals grew more frequent and more tense. The grand ceremonial dignity that once marked their gatherings had been replaced by terse discussions, urgent gestures, and the unmistakable cadence of worry. They parsed canon law with trembling hands, debated centuries-old precedents with desperation, just barely hidden behind Latin phrases. Some urged for the formal declaration of sede vacante, insisting the church could not afford to drift rudderless in the world's most turbulent century. Others balked at the notion. How could they declare the see vacant when there was no death, no resignation, no word? Apostolic succession was sacred, but so too was clarity, and clarity was vanishing. Across the papal states and beyond, the ripple spread. Bishops in the countryside sent anxious, coded letters to Rome, asking for guidance. Monasteries fasted in coordinated waves, lifting up prayers not for the miraculous return of the pontiff, but for the revelation of truth, however bitter it might be. In Venice, a senior cardinal refused to say Mass until the Pope was found or declared, an act that sparked quiet outrage in some corners and reverent imitation in others. In Milan, a statue of the Virgin reportedly shed a tear. Some called it a sign, others an illusion. Still others whispered that the tear was not miraculous, but mourning. By nightfall, the nature of the whispers had changed. What had begun as speculation turned darker, more personal, more surreal. Conspiracy took root, growing wild through rumor and memory. Some said an illegal conclave had already convened in secret, that the most powerful of the church had decided they could wait no longer. Others swore the Pope had fled of his own volition, that he had vanished to escape something, not someone. A reckoning, perhaps, a punishment from heaven. Several servants reported strange behavior in the days before the disappearance. One recalled him standing before a sealed door deep in the archives, murmuring prayers no one recognized. Another claimed he had not slept for 3 nights, pacing, always pacing. The Swiss Guard, long regarded as ceremonial figures in brightly colored uniforms, had transformed. They were no longer ornaments to tradition. They were vigilant, sharp-eyed, and tense. Their patrols tightened. Their formations shifted. They stood not just at gates, but in corridors, outside chapels, beside doors that had once remained open. Their role had subtly, but unmistakably changed. From guardians of image to protectors of something more primal. The church's vulnerable heart. The apostolic palace, once accessible to senior clergy and trusted aides, was locked down. Those who once walked freely through its echoing halls now found themselves halted at threshold after threshold. Even high-ranking archbishops were denied entry. The palace had become a tomb, not of marble and relics, but of withheld truths. And still, that solitary candle burned. In the papal bedchamber, the candle remained lit beside the untouched bed. The flame, carefully tended by rotating attendants, had grown into something symbolic. No longer merely a gesture of waiting, but a beacon of silent vigil. A marker not just of hope, but of liminality. The space between presence and absence, life and legacy. The crucifix on the wall had gathered a film of dust. The slippers lay precisely where they had been placed 3 nights earlier. A letter rested on the nightstand, unsealed, unread. Not a soul dared to unfold it. Beyond the city, beyond Italy, the world began to notice. Protestant and Orthodox leaders issued statements of prayerful solidarity, though behind closed doors, analysts speculated with growing curiosity. A delegation from Brussels had offered aid in coordinating international security. The Vatican politely declined, but the very suggestion sparked deeper unease. Was the world watching with compassion or with anticipation? In far corners of the globe, voices filled the void. A preacher in Brazil claimed the Pope had ascended to heaven directly. In Nigeria, another warned of apocalyptic signs. A child in the Philippines described a dream in which the Holy Father wandered among stars, surrounded by silent angels. Pilgrims arrived, not only to pray, but to witness. They filled the city with their questions, their cameras, and their quiet dread. What the church had never allowed itself to admit, its own fragility, was now on display. For centuries it had claimed to stand apart from the chaos of the world, rooted in eternal truth. And yet now, it trembled. Even the rock of Peter seemed to waver. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the frescoes loomed. Adam reached out to his creator. Jesus separated the saved from the damned. Grand, solemn, eternal. But today, those scenes offered no reassurance. They had become mirrors, reflecting not divine certainty, but human fear. Dusk fell on the 3rd day, with no word, no movement, no change. The window remained dark. The halls remained quiet. The candle still burned. And in that thin sliver of silence before night deepened, Rome again held its breath, waiting not for answers, but for the courage to ask the right questions. The morning of the 4th day arrived with an eerie calm, the kind that doesn't comfort, but unsettles, a stillness not of peace, but of pause. Rome awakened beneath a dull gray sky, the sunlight struggling to filter through a curtain of cloud. The cobbled streets remained damp from a night of gentle rain, and in the early hours, the sound of footfalls echoed louder than usual, as though the city itself were listening. The bells of distant churches rang, their tolls hollow, missing the subtle power of purpose. For centuries, the papal city had defined itself by continuity, its rhythms, its rituals, its unbroken line. But now, those rhythms felt stilted, those rituals weightless. The absence of the Pope was no longer a strange anomaly. It was becoming a fact, a weight pressing down on the conscience of the Church. St. Peter's Basilica, the beating heart of Catholicism, stood as grand and imposing as ever. Its dome loomed over the city, a monument to divine permanence. But within its sacred boundaries, doubt had taken root. The priests who moved through the basilica did so with practiced reverence, Yet their eyes betrayed a searching. Every liturgy, every procession now felt like it was performed in shadow. The Holy Father's chair remained empty. The gospel readings were delivered, but with a hesitance that made the words sound unfamiliar. Visitors who once lined up for confessions now sat silently in pews, heads bowed not in prayer, but in bewilderment. In the apostolic palace, the corridors remained sealed to all but a shrinking circle of inner guards and administrators. Vatican archivists, normally left to their quiet studies, were suddenly summoned and questioned. There was talk of doors long sealed, of tomes never opened. Some whispered of documents kept hidden even from cardinals, locked behind iron-latched gates in chambers carved beneath the Vatican library. The prefect of the Apostolic Archive had not been seen publicly in 2 days. His aides insisted he was merely overseeing internal inquiries, but others were not so sure. The deeper the Vatican looked inward, the more it seemed to realize that its mysteries ran deeper than anyone was prepared to confront. Inside the Secretariat of State, where policy and diplomacy converged, the mood had shifted. The conversations, once diplomatic in tone, had grown blunt. Should the absence extend another day, an announcement would need to be made, not to answer questions, but to frame them, to guide the narrative before it slipped beyond the Vatican's grasp. Yet, consensus remained elusive. The press office crafted drafts of statements that were edited, reviewed, and then discarded. The phrases felt too fragile, too meager to contain the enormity of what was happening. One line read, "The Holy Father remains in prayerful seclusion." Another, more daring, was rejected outright. "The Holy See is presently without visible guidance." The Swiss Guard held their positions, their ceremonial halberds gleaming beneath the overcast sky. But their presence no longer comforted. It unsettled. These were not the smiling protectors of the Vatican postcard. These were men on high alert, responding to a crisis that had not yet been named. Rumors flew of locked rooms and whispered commands, of surveillance tapes reviewed in secret, of shadows where none should be. The Apostolic Signatura, the highest judicial authority in the Church, met in private, discussing not theological debates but contingencies. Some feared schism, others worse. Elsewhere, the world grew louder. News outlets speculated freely. Theories multiplied, each more outlandish than the last. Headlines read like prophecies. Where is the Pope? Silence in the Vatican. A throne unclaimed. Social media brimmed with fervor. Live streams broadcast the silent papal window. Threads unraveled timelines, dissected papal appearances, highlighted gestures and facial expressions from months prior. Experts debated canon law with unprecedented vigor, while skeptics questioned the Church's grip on truth. In Buenos Aires, a group gathered in the cathedral for an all-night vigil. In Manila, thousands marched in silent procession, holding candles and portraits of the Holy Father. In Warsaw, nuns knelt in the snow, praying without pause. The world was responding not just to absence, but to what the absence revealed. The papacy had never been just a man. It was a symbol of continuity, of divine presence among the fallible. Now, that symbol flickered. Inside the Vatican gardens, a small group of monastics walked in silence, tracing the winding paths where popes had once found refuge from the demands of office. Their steps were careful, reverent, yet uncertain. At the foot of a statue of Saint Joseph, they paused. One monk knelt, removed his cowl, and whispered a prayer in Latin. Domine, quid est veritas? Lord, what is truth? That question, once asked by Pontius Pilate, now echoed through the chambers of the Vatican, and no one, not even the most devout, the most learned, the most powerful, had dared to answer it aloud. The morning of the 8th day unfolded, not with triumphant horns or sacred bells, but with a hushed gray stillness that settled like dust over the eternal city. Rome, once a city of jubilant processions and stirring rituals, now lay subdued, its heart slowed to a reverent murmur. The shadows of the Vatican stretched across the damp cobblestones of St. Peter's Square, lengthened by a sun that seemed to hesitate at the edge of the world. It was a pale, weary orb, struggling to burn through a tension that clung to the city, not like the light mist of dawn, but like the heavy shroud of mourning. A full week had passed since the Pope vanished, not abdicated, not buried, simply gone. And in his absence, the silence had deepened. Not a temporary hush, but a thickening, a weight that gathered in corners and echoed through hallways. It wasn't the quiet of mystery. It was the quiet of waiting, of bearing witness to something no one could yet name. This was no longer an event. It was becoming a condition. Pilgrims still arrived, but the waves were smaller now. The curious and the casual had departed, driven home by empty wallets, sore feet, or the growing unease that hung in the air. Those who remained were different. These were the steadfast, the seekers, the faithful, who came not for spectacle, but for surrender. Among them moved monks from Mount Athos, cloaked in ash-colored robes, their bare feet cracked and bleeding, their chants spoken in ancient cadences that made the air tremble. Nuns from Ireland circled the square endlessly, their rosaries flowing bead by bead, each prayer a whispered thread of devotion. Silent men and women lined the outer walls of the Vatican, their gazes locked on the darkened papal window above. They did not weep. They did not blink. They simply waited, as statues wait for meaning. Within the walls of the Curia, anxiety had not subsided. It had hardened. Tension had become fossilized, layered into the marble, the mahogany, the velvet drapes. The College of Cardinals no longer gathered in debate. They whispered in shadowed corridors, met behind bolted doors. Words were few, glances fewer. Memos circulated like contraband, signatures scribbled with shaking hands, seals pressed too quickly, as if even wax had grown afraid. The unity that had once bound them now splintered beneath the weight of silence. Suspicions bloomed like mold in dark corners. Had the Holy Father been betrayed from within? Had he been taken by divine force? Or something far worse? And elsewhere, new figures had begun to appear in the Vatican's passageways. Jesuits from distant missions arrived in the hush of twilight, their eyes sharp with unspoken knowledge. Opus Dei members were seen in chapels, where they didn't usually pray, their brief words exchanged in tones of warning. Archivists from the secret archives walked the halls with urgent steps and sunken eyes, pulling centuries-old volumes, examining codes, tracing patterns only they could understand. Something had been disturbed, an ancient knowledge, long dormant. Whispers spoke of a sealed door deep in the Vatican library that had been found slightly open. That door had not moved in over 100 years. It was said a manuscript had vanished, a text whose name no one dared to utter. One custodian was quietly dismissed. Another was found in the map room, on his knees before a Renaissance fresco of a sea that no longer existed, whispering to it as if it could reply. Signs mounted. At 2 a.m., the bells of Santa Maria in Trastevere rang without cause. No hand pulled their ropes. When questioned, the sacristan only replied that the ropes had moved on their own. In a convent outside Naples, a statue of the infant Christ was discovered, turned to face the wall. No nun would admit to touching it. And in the Vatican gardens, the pure white doves, symbols of peace, of the Holy Spirit, refused to fly. Their cages remained open, but they would not leave. The apostolic palace stood at the center of it all, now less a residence than a reliquary. Guards held their posts, but their expressions were no longer stern, they were haunted. Inside, the Pope's bed lay untouched. A single candle, still burning, its flame no longer steady, It trembled, flickered, danced without wind. On the nightstand, the letter remained, unread. But rumors now said someone had entered the room to retrieve it. Nothing was taken, but impressions were found on the carpet. 2 knees pressed deeply into the fibers, indentations like shadows left behind by devotion or despair. Outside the Vatican, the secular world began to tremble. The tone changed. Where once newscasters smirked and pundits speculated, now came only solemn voices. Where once politicians offered platitudes, now came silence. The Pope had not fallen ill. He had not stepped down. He had not been abducted. And yet, he was gone. There was no announcement, no replacement, no directive, just absence, a church without a shepherd, a throne without a shadow. And so, as the last light of the 8th day dimmed over the Roman skyline, a deeper shift began to stir. Not fear, something older, deeper, primeval. The people had stopped asking where the Pope was. They began to ask, instead, what had been awakened in his place. The 9th day dawned with a gloom that seemed almost deliberate, as though the sun itself had grown weary of shining on a city so gripped by uncertainty, it had decided to hide in protest. Rome, still shuffling on the surface, moved like a memory of itself, a faded echo of imperial strength caught in the grip of something it could not name. It was a city alive, but only just. The rhythm of its streets resembled mourning, a mourning not for the fallen, but for the vanished, the undefined, the unexplainable. Its walls, once sturdy witnesses to triumph and ruin, seemed confused, as if unsure whether they should brace for another invasion or finally exhale. The marble steps of the great basilicas, worn smooth by centuries of kneeling pilgrims, carried fresh scuff marks now from feet pacing back and forth, from prayers repeated not in praise or penitence, but in desperation. Gone were the prayers for peace or forgiveness. Now, they were for revelation, for a sign, for the return of a man who had departed without a word, without a trace, leaving only questions in his place. Within the Vatican, the mechanisms of centuries-old tradition began to fray at the seams. The liturgical rhythms that had once anchored faith now felt like performances, their meaning hollowed by absence. Incense still curled through chapel air, and Latin hymns still echoed under gilded domes, but they lacked their former gravity. The faithful sang with strained voices. Even the Swiss guards, trained to stoic perfection, crossed themselves more often, their fingers twitching at the handles of their halberds, their eyes darting to corners where shadows moved without origin. Whispers crept through the barracks. Some claimed to see silhouettes glide past doorways where no one had walked in hours. Others swore they heard voices chanting psalms in the dead of night, the verses spoken in dialects no longer living, pulled from centuries past and whispered with urgent clarity. The Sistine Chapel was abruptly closed to the public. The official explanation cited maintenance. But those who worked in the Vatican knew better. Something had been discovered. A single cherub in Michelangelo's great ceiling had lost its face, not gradually with age, but overnight. The pigment flaked away in one smooth, unnatural event. Scaffolding was erected quickly, but not to restore, to conceal. Beneath the ancient plaster, a message had been revealed. No one outside a tight circle of cardinals had seen it, but one who did reportedly collapsed on the spot. He was carried out on a stretcher and has not been seen since. No official statement followed. Strange things were happening elsewhere, too. In Trastevere, devotional candles extinguished themselves no matter how often they were relit. At the Scala Sancta, pilgrims found the holy stairs colder than ice, so cold they left burns through layers of cloth. And in the subterranean chapel of San Clemente, water began to rise. Not from above, but from below, trickling upward in fine streams that defied gravity, arching like inverted tears and leaving behind rust-red stains on the altar. Scientists were called. Historians, too. None stayed long. One physicist reportedly flew back to Geneva without collecting his instruments. Beyond Rome, anxiety spread like a slow poison through the Catholic world. Bishops in South America convened emergency synods. African dioceses lit prayer fires and organized all-night vigils. In Asia, monastic communities went silent, meditating not for peace, but for insight. Within the Vatican, the press office released sterile statements, ongoing spiritual discernment, unprecedented personal retreat, private theological reflection by the Holy Father. But behind closed doors, phones rang without rest. No leader knew what to say. No one had imagined this scenario. There was no precedent, no protocol, no plan. Speculation erupted in the vacuum. Some said it was a divine sign. Others whispered of a punishment. Apocalyptic groups sprang up across Europe, declaring the arrival of the final days. In Milan, a fringe sect built a replica of Peter's throne, believing the Pope had been assumed into heaven like Elijah of old. Thousands gathered in Buenos Aires and knelt before the cathedral, chanting prayers of welcome and return. In Ethiopia, an ancient sect proclaimed this the beginning of the silence of the throne, a time they claimed had been prophesied in lost Gnostic texts, a period of absence before ultimate reconciliation. And yet, in Rome itself, the fear wore a quieter face. Trains still ran. Gelato vendors still scooped vanilla and hazelnut. Tourists smiled and snapped photos in front of the Pantheon. But even the pigeons seemed reluctant to land. The laughter in cafes came with an edge. Conversations paused whenever church bells rang. And in the Roman Forum, where stray cats used to sun themselves on marble ruins, the animals had vanished entirely. Inside the Apostolic Library, unease manifested as activity. Scrolls once untouched for centuries were moved in secret. Rare codices disappeared from their display cases and were never logged as borrowed. A senior archivist boarded a flight to Jerusalem with a steel case handcuffed to his wrist. Another vanished en route to Istanbul. No notices, no press briefings, just silence and more of it. As the 9th day came to its end, no truths had emerged, no new messages, just the continuation of the unknown. The absence of the pontiff had grown into something greater than a missing man. It was now a question that could not be asked aloud, a presence that cast no shadow but refused to be ignored. Rome did not rest. It did not rage. It simply waited, paused on a breath held too long, teetering on the edge of a revelation no one was ready to face. The 10th day unfolded not with drama, but with a hush so heavy it seemed to blanket the entire city in reverence and dread. The sky was overcast once more, a canopy of gray that seemed to press downward, as if the heavens themselves were crouching to listen. The clouds hung low and slow, dragging their bellies across the ancient skyline as if they too were burdened with apprehension. Rome, tired and brittle, looked not merely like a city of stone and memory, but like a relic of something long departed. A capital whose stones once echoed with the force of imperial decree, now reduced to a waiting room for the unknowable. The Vatican had quieted further still. Where once the rhythms of sacred routine gave the smallest corridors purpose and life, now there was only stillness. The great fountains in St. Peter's Square still burbled, but the sound rang unnatural in the vacuum left by absent pilgrims and silent clergy. The pigeons circled fewer times before landing. Security details doubled at every entrance and hallway, yet there was no enemy to confront, only the persistent, gnawing sense of something that might never arrive. Guards paced with habitual diligence, but their eyes held the weary confusion of those tasked with guarding a place from nothing, or perhaps from everything. Inside the Apostolic Palace, protocol had faded into improvisation. Meals arrived and remained untouched. Calendars were inked with appointments no one would keep. The members of the Curia gathered in uneasy clusters, robes of cardinal red dimmed by dimmer moods. Latin, the language of eternity, returned not out of piety, but because modern tongues felt insufficient. In one meeting, a bishop from Krakow broke into sobs during the recitation of Psalm 88, the despair of the words making even seasoned clerics glance away. The gravity was no longer just procedural. It was spiritual and deeply personal. In the office of the papal sacristy, the signs of absence were most pronounced. The white cassock, once pristine on the shoulders of the Holy Father, remained untouched, on its hook. The red mozzetta, carefully folded, sat like a flag in mourning. The ring of the fisherman had not been destroyed. According to centuries of custom, it should have been shattered upon the death of a pope. But no one dared touch it. It remained locked away, as though acknowledging its presence would make the absence irreversible. Whispers of unexplainable events now passed hand to hand like contraband. A bell rang in the north transept of St. John Lateran, 3 perfect chimes in an empty space. In the crypt beneath St. Paul, outside the walls, a flame was seen hovering above the tomb, not flickering, not wavering, simply there. Security footage offered nothing. One technician tasked with retrieving backups vanished after work. His apartment was undisturbed. Shoes neatly placed, phone charging, passport where it should be. He was simply gone. Elsewhere, the church's vast network trembled. In Mexico City, the faithful began an unbroken rosary vigil, circling the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, as if their prayers could reach beyond flesh. In Krakow, clergy walked barefoot through snow bearing relics that had not been touched since the darkest plagues of medieval Europe. In Kinshasa, dozens of people claimed to see an apparition of the Virgin Mary, veiled and weeping, her hands outstretched in a posture that looked less like blessing and more like a warning. None of them had met before. Their stories matched exactly. The media turned fevered. Caution gave way to frenzy. Headlines stopped asking and began declaring. "Where is the Pope?" screamed across tickers, banners, push notifications. Vatican spokesmen appeared gaunt on screen, their reassurances flimsier each day. They pleaded for patience, for faith, for silence. But the noise was already deafening. Conspiracy surged online. Some blamed the Jesuits. Others claimed extraterrestrial abduction. A few believed this was all a performance to distract from a global shift that had already begun. Truth, if it existed, was drowning in the flood. In the streets of Rome, the city continued in an echo of itself. Cafes served coffee and murmurs. Schools held sessions, but recesses were canceled. Churches unlocked their doors but remained dim. Even candles flickered less bravely. One nurse near Campo de' Fiori told a reporter it felt like the world had swallowed a scream and couldn't let it out. The air itself felt thicker, not dangerous, just heavy, as if infused with something that had no name, but knew you by yours. That night, for the first time in recent memory, the lights of St. Peter's Dome were not illuminated. There was no explanation, no outage, no announcement. And yet, no one called to complain. No one demanded answers. The absence said more than any press release ever could. It wasn't an oversight. It was a moment of collective, breathless recognition. The church had survived heresies, crusades, schisms, world wars, and scandal. But this was something else. This was not decay. It was not corruption. It was erasure, gentle and thorough. The 10th day did not end in terror or in revelation. It ended with something far more difficult to articulate, a silence so profound it made the idea of sound seem like a forgotten invention. And still, Rome waited. On the 11th day, the Vatican's silence did not merely continue, it deepened. By now, the hush had become almost architectural, as though it had woven itself into the marble, brick, and bone of the city itself. The air inside St. Peter's Basilica held the density of an ancient tomb, a breathless stillness that pressed down on the lungs and reminded every visitor that something immense was missing. Not just the man in white, but the spiritual gravitational pull he represented. Pilgrims no longer wept or prayed aloud. They simply stood, heads bowed, their silence indistinguishable from mourning. Outside, the Roman streets had adjusted to the strangeness with a strange dignity of their own. Vendors no longer hawked Vatican souvenirs. Tour guides skipped St. Peter's on their routes entirely. Even the traffic seemed to slow as cars passed beneath Bernini's colonnades. Something intangible yet immense hovered over the city, unshakable and sovereign. Conversations were quieter. The bells of distant churches rang more slowly, their tones resonating just a little longer than usual, as if unsure whether they still had an audience. Inside the apostolic palace, corridors once trodden by centuries of authority were largely empty. The guards had adopted a ceremonial stiffness, their movements devoid of the casual humanity that once filled the space between duty and belief. Those who still worked within Vatican walls did so with a nervous purpose. Hands trembled while adjusting vestments on mannequins that would not be worn. Liturgical scripts were reviewed, revised, and re-reviewed, not out of need, but habit. It was a pageant rehearsed without a lead. In the heart of the Vatican library, ancient texts lay undisturbed, but not untouched. Several scholars now spent their days poring over obscure prophecies, forgotten correspondence from obscure councils, and apocryphal writings rejected centuries ago. One Jesuit librarian began compiling a private ledger titled simply Unlikely Ends. He made no announcement. He shared it with no one. But every day he returned to the same desk, flipping page after brittle page, eyes scanning for what history might have overlooked. At the edges of the city, others searched differently. In the underground passages beneath Castel Sant'Angelo, clergy and guards walked shoulder to shoulder, investigating places long sealed and ignored. They found nothing, but still they returned each day, as though something essential waited just beyond visibility. They began bringing relics, small crosses, bits of saintly bone, strands of hair once clipped from beatified heads, as if proximity to holiness might shake loose an answer. Further afield, the ripples grew. In monasteries in Tibet, bells were rung for the Pope by monks who had never spoken his name aloud. In Istanbul, the Patriarch ordered a rare service in Latin. In Cairo, a group of Coptic Christians walked barefoot across the desert to pray in silence at an abandoned fortress, claiming a vision had called them. All of these events occurred without coordination, and yet, somehow, they harmonized. Back in Rome, strange phenomena persisted. A nun at the church of Santa Maria in Trastevere swore she saw a shadow pass across the altar during Vespers, though the doors were locked and no one stood nearby. A parishioner reported that the water in a holy font had turned slightly red, not blood, but like diluted wine. No one tested it. No one touched it. It was emptied the next day, quietly, without ceremony. The church's spokespeople, now few and visibly drained, refused further questions from the press. Cameras, once welcomed within Vatican walls, were turned away. Press passes were revoked. The world's largest spiritual institution had sealed itself within. And the people? They waited. Not in fear anymore, but in suspension, like characters who had forgotten their next line. A ritual without a prayer, a flock without a shepherd. In some places, they gathered to sing, not hymns, but lullabies, as if they might sing someone back from wherever they had gone. The Pope had not been declared dead. No funeral had been planned. No conclave summoned. His apartments remained lit, though no one entered. The ring remained untouched. The cassock remained pressed. And so the 11th day came to a close, not with despair, but with a heavy peace, the kind that settles only after a long anticipated guest fails to arrive. Not gone, not forgotten, just missing from the center of the world's most ancient circle. And in that absence, the faithful still dared to hope, but dared less each day. On the 12th day, the silence in Vatican City no longer felt imposed. It felt inherited, as if the stillness had become a relic passed down from day to day. The city did not just continue waiting, it endured the wait with an almost reverent fatigue. The faithful who had once crowded St. Peter's Square now came in smaller numbers, more subdued, more private. Some stood with candles that flickered even in the still air, holding them like frail extensions of belief. Others sat on the stone benches for hours, not speaking, their eyes fixed not on the basilica but on some internal horizon. Within the Sistine Chapel, the air itself seemed heavier, the sacred art somehow quieter. Michelangelo's frescoes, the creation of Adam, the Last Judgment, had always stirred awe. Now they seemed to mourn. Tourists were no longer admitted. Instead, priests took turns, standing alone beneath the dome, gazing upward in contemplation or silent interrogation, as if waiting for the ceiling to speak. At the Vatican Observatory, astronomers continued their work, but they too were affected. Charts were plotted with unnecessary precision. Telescope lenses were cleaned twice as often as needed. One Jesuit scientist spent hours staring into the dark sky, claiming he was not looking for stars, but for a sign. He would not say what kind. When asked if he had seen anything, he only said, "We are not the only ones waiting." Inside the Secretariat of State, meetings grew shorter and rarer. Ministers arrived late and left early. Decisions were postponed indefinitely. One staffer, once responsible for global diplomatic correspondence, now spent his days reading papal encyclicals aloud to himself, annotating the margins with trembling hands. Aides whispered about him, but no one intervened. Elsewhere, in the Vatican museums, the art seemed to resist silence. The eyes of painted saints followed passers-by more urgently. A tapestry that had hung undisturbed for centuries slipped from its hooks one night. When found the next morning, it lay perfectly folded, as though someone, or something, had done it with care. No alarms had been triggered. Beyond Vatican walls, ripple effects began to manifest in subtler ways. In Lima, a priest fainted mid-sermon while quoting Augustine. In Quebec, an old cathedral bell rang at midnight without being touched. In a small town in Bavaria, a statue of the Virgin was found weeping, not blood or water, but something like dew, fine and persistent, trickling down her stone cheeks. None of these incidents were verified, none were officially acknowledged, and yet each added to the atmosphere of the uncanny. The media, increasingly cut off from Vatican officials, turned to speculation. Was the Pope ill, hidden, abducted, transformed? Conspiracy theories flourished, most of them dismissed quickly. But a few caught fire. One theory posited that the Pope had entered a secret fast, refusing all contact in an act of divine penance. Another suggested he had never left his private chapel after a vision. Still others whispered about an ancient prophecy long buried in Vatican vaults, now unfolding in silence. Inside his residence, it was said the Pope's bed remained undisturbed, the linens unchanged, the pillows unpressed, but lights were seen on at night. The guards, ever stone-faced, offered no explanations. Meals were left at the door, but rarely touched. One day a tray returned with a single host missing, and the kitchen staff wept at the sight. No one knew why. In St. Peter's Square, an old woman was seen kneeling in the exact center of the piazza. She remained there for nearly 8 hours, unmoving. When approached gently by police, she whispered, "He is not gone. He is deciding." Then she rose, smiled, and left without another word. The 12th day ended with twilight settling over the dome like a closing eye. Rome exhaled a breath it had held too long. The silence, now almost a companion, thickened once more. Not oppressive, not yet, but different. Something was coming, or had already arrived. The church waited still, but now it waited not just for news. It waited for revelation. On the 13th day, Vatican City felt less like a city-state and more like a reliquary, an ornate container for something too sacred, too mysterious to name. The entire place seemed suspended in time, a breath held in the chest of Christendom. St. Peter's Square, usually bustling with tourists, clergy, and pilgrims, had fallen under a peculiar hush. The cobblestones glistened faintly in the morning sun, polished not by brooms or machines, but by something unseen, as though the stones themselves had been reverently preparing for a procession that never came. Pilgrims, who had traveled from every corner of the earth, now lingered at the periphery of the square, unwilling to step into its heart. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn, beyond which only silence was allowed to tread. The fountains flowed as always, but with a different voice. The familiar splashes had taken on an echo, an eerie resonance, like whispers trapped in a cathedral vault. The water spoke, but not in any language anyone could understand. Still, everyone heard it. They just couldn't describe what it said. The Swiss Guard, known for their colorful Renaissance uniforms and rigid discipline, began rotating posts more frequently than usual, not out of protocol, but necessity, not because of the heat or any visible threat, but because of something else, exhaustion that wasn't of the body. Their eyes, usually neutral and unreadable, betrayed them. This was the exhaustion of knowing, of seeing something that could not be discussed, of standing witness to an unexplainable stillness in the heart of the Vatican. When approached by reporters or visitors, they gave polite, standard responses, but always their eyes drifted to the apostolic palace, to the papal windows, to the unmoving drapes. Inside the apostolic library, a strange and unspoken ritual had taken root. Archivists, those keepers of knowledge and mystery, began retrieving volumes not listed on any reading schedule. They opened calfskin-bound tomes that had sat untouched for decades, maybe centuries. One elderly priest was seen gently transcribing a 14th century letter from a pope who claimed to see angels in his dreams, writing with a quill as though modern pens could not contain what needed to be preserved. Another read aloud from Revelation, voice monotone, hands shaking. The others didn't stop him. They simply bowed their heads and listened. Out in the Vatican gardens, an unusual hush had descended. The usual hum of birds, insects, and wind through olive branches had stilled, as if nature itself was listening. Even the birds avoided the olive trees where the Pope once took his evening walks. A gardener, long employed and not prone to fantasy, reported something strange. Roses near the grotto bloomed out of season. Their petals were pale, colorless, almost ghostly. When asked if he had touched them, he shook his head and murmured, "They are not ours to tend." In the Pauline Chapel, a cardinal had been seen praying alone, sometimes for hours. His whispered Latin wasn't grand or ceremonial. It was raw, urgent, pleading. He left behind his rosary, a simple one, worn smooth by decades of use. When a young seminarian found it, the beads were still warm. Returned to the cardinal, he refused to take them back. "It belongs where it was needed," he said, and walked away. In the broader city of Rome, sleep was elusive for many of the clergy. Priests and nuns reported waking in the dead of night, not startled from dreams, but with a distinct feeling of being watched, not with dread, but with an intimacy that was unbearable in its intensity. One nun whispered in confession that a voice had spoken to her, not in sound, but deep within her bones. The message was simple but unsettling. Wait longer. Beyond Italy, strange things unfolded. Churches across continents lit vigil candles without instruction. In São Paulo, an entire congregation remained after Mass, singing ancient chants in total darkness. In Dublin, a cathedral choir gathered unprompted in the nave and stood in perfect silence until the sun rose. In the Philippines, a child walked to the altar and placed a crayon drawing of the Pope, his face blank, a single tear on the cheek, without saying a word. The world's media, now increasingly shut out of Vatican affairs, turned instead to symbolism. One well-known anchor, known for her skepticism, ended her nightly broadcast by asking viewers to light candles. Another journalist cried openly on air while reading a letter from a viewer that asked only, "What is silence trying to say to us?" And through it all, the papal apartment remained still. No shadows moved, no whispers were heard, no light flickered behind the windows. Yet each morning, without fail, a single candle in the papal window was relit. Always the same size, always the same steady flame. As if whoever or whatever was inside didn't need to eat, drink, or speak, only to remind the world that it was still watching. Beneath Vatican Hill, in the necropolis where bones of saints and martyrs lay encased in history and stone, something imperceptible shifted. No earthquake was felt. No statues toppled. But those who worked among the tombs swore the air grew denser. Torches flickered in ways that defied drafts. One archaeologist, seasoned and rational, packed her belongings and left her post without notice. Her only explanation, offered in a whisper, "The saints are listening." By the end of that long, suffocating 13th day, the question on everyone's lips had changed. It was no longer, "Where is the Pope?" Instead, it had become something deeper, stranger, and infinitely harder to answer. What is beginning in his absence? Faith had not disappeared. It had evolved. It had taken on a quieter, more fragile shape. A kind of faith one keeps in the darkness, when stars are veiled by cloud, and yet you look up anyway, not because you see, but because you must believe something is still there. On the 14th day, the lines between devotion, dread, and the inexplicable had all but vanished, melting into a thick and unrelenting haze that draped itself over Vatican City like fog that forgot how to lift. The silence that once signaled reverence now carried a weight beyond ritual or prayer. It pressed against the skin, soaked into the breath, and wrapped its fingers around the bone. This was no absence of sound. It was a presence, tangible, ancient, and steadily tightening its grip. It crept through the arches, echoed faintly down colonnades, and lingered in the corners where the holy met the unknowable. The great square outside St. Peter's Basilica remained eerily vacant, though no official edict had ever closed it. There were no barricades, no posted signs, no cordons, no soldiers. People simply ceased going near. The cobblestones, once trodden by pilgrims and wanderers alike, now stretched untouched beneath a gray sky that had not changed in hue for days. Even the pigeons, ubiquitous inhabitants of the square, avoided its center. The towering obelisk, which for centuries had stood as a silent witness to the rhythms of faith, now repelled birds as though vibrating with an energy invisible to human perception, but repulsive to creatures that could feel shifts we pretend not to notice. Street vendors drifted 2 or 3 blocks away, without coordinating, without saying a word. They just stopped setting up. The priests who once moved through the square in cassocks to offer blessings quietly stopped appearing. Tourists who strayed too close walked faster, eyes lowered, voices hushed, as if they'd brushed the edge of something they didn't understand and didn't want to. As if the heart of Christendom had developed a pulse all its own. And it wasn't entirely human. Inside the Vatican museums, an unnatural stillness settled over sacred halls and ancient artifacts. The echo of footsteps in marble corridors became rare. Security staff, once assigned in careful rotation, now requested reassignment elsewhere. No one openly admitted fear, but reasons piled up: family obligations, sudden illness, inexplicable exhaustion. One guard stationed near the gallery of maps began hearing something unusual. Low, rhythmic, unmistakably human chanting. Gregorian in style. Melodic, ancient, and undeniably present. But there were no choirs booked, no speakers installed. Every time he rounded the corner in search of its source, the sound stopped completely. Clean, abrupt, as if silenced by a switch. He reported it once, then never again, not even when others began to hear it too. The Vatican pharmacy began receiving odd visitors. Ancient-seeming monks appeared without speaking, sliding handwritten notes for oils and tinctures no longer listed in inventory. Their requests were archaic, ingredients barely known even to archivists. One cloistered nun, a woman who hadn't left her convent in over 4 decades, stepped into the pharmacy, eyes wide, hands trembling. She requested laurel leaves. When the pharmacist gently asked why, she simply said, "It's time," and turned to leave, without waiting for a reply. Another requested oil of hyssop and a brass crucible. A third handed over a list scrawled in Latin so old it had to be translated twice to understand. A red velvet drapery fluttered in one of the upper windows of the apostolic palace. There was no breeze, yet the fabric moved, not randomly, but with the shape and pattern of something brushing past it from inside. The Vatican's surveillance cameras captured the moment. Within hours, analysts reviewed the footage for wind anomalies, air pressure shifts, structural irregularities. Nothing explained it. The clip flooded social media. Users dubbed it the blink. Less than 2 seconds long, and yet millions watched it on loop, some claiming they saw a silhouette behind the curtain. Others insisted it was just the fabric, but the conclusion they shared was more instinctive than logical. He was still there. Or if not him, something was. That night, a tremor passed under Rome. Barely a quake, just enough to nudge wine glasses, to make chandeliers sway. But beneath St. Peter's Basilica, a fine crack traced a path across the marble floor. From the nave, it ran with precise alignment toward the altar. Architects arrived to survey it. The fracture defied expectations. It didn't follow the stress points of the structure. No fault lines. No previous damage. It looked as if someone, or something, had etched it by design, as though the earth itself had been scored with a straight blade, marking a passageway that had not yet been opened, or that someone was beginning to. In the Vatican radio tower, a technician monitoring overnight frequencies experienced what he thought was a malfunction. The signal dropped, not into static, but into something else entirely. A low, thudding pulse overtook the audio feed at exactly 3 a.m. It sounded unmistakably like a heartbeat. Slow, calm, strong. It played for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, then faded. The equipment remained intact. Nothing had failed. But when technicians replayed the recording, there was nothing. Just silence. Only the man who'd been on duty insisted the heartbeat was real. "It wasn't something I heard," he said. "It was something I felt. It ran through my chest like a bell being struck." Far from the Vatican, strange things stirred. In Nairobi, a child described dreaming of a tall man in white robes walking through a library made entirely of light. In Lisbon, a centuries-old bell rang once at midnight, its clapper rusted, its rope removed long ago. In Detroit, a mural of St. Peter that had been untouched for years appeared changed. His keys were gone, and his eyes now looked not at the viewer, but upward. In Kyoto, an incense burner that had lain cold for centuries lit itself without flame. In Patagonia, a shepherd claimed the sheep all knelt at dawn and didn't rise for over an hour. No conclave had been summoned. There had been no funeral, no declaration of resignation, no proclamation of heresy, no falling out. And yet across the globe, bishops penned private letters that all began the same way. If he does not return, not if he passes, not if he abdicates, just does not return. As if return had become a decision only he, or something greater than he, could now make. As if they had begun to understand that this absence was not a pause, it was a reckoning. And still, the candle burned. From the window above, in the same place it had always been, It remained lit, unflickering, undiminished, as though untouched by wind or time, a flame that did not consume, did not melt. It stood watch, not with warmth, but with a stillness that made people wonder. Was it a beacon? A message? A warning? Or all three? Waiting for someone to understand, or someone to arrive, or someone to return. The morning of the 15th day arrived in Vatican City, not with the usual roll of bells or the echoing hum of whispered prayers, but with a deeper quiet, one that bordered on both reverence and dread, pressing down like an invisible hand over the cobbled streets and spired rooftops. This wasn't the stillness of early dawn, nor the hush before a sacred service. It was different, denser, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened, refusing to allow sound or motion to pass freely. The sky hung iron gray above the city, like a lid fitted too tightly over a vessel. There was no breeze to stir the cypress trees, no ripple in the fountains, no birdsong or footstep. Everything, each shadowed window, each alleyway, each breath drawn in fear or awe, was suspended in a pause too long to be natural. Even the pigeons that typically circled above the square remained grounded. Inside St. Peter's Basilica, the golden altar gleamed with a surreal clarity under rows of suspended chandeliers. Each flame burned tall and still, resisting the natural flicker, as if conscious of the role it played. But below that glowing canopy, on the marble floor where the first fault line had appeared the night before, a second fracture now unfurled, smooth, unbroken, and eerily symmetrical. It mirrored the original crack with unsettling precision. Not a structural fault, confirmed the engineers summoned at dawn, but something more enigmatic. They found the lines too clean, the edges too intentional, as though etched not by time or tectonics, but by design, by a hand that neither time nor reason understood. The cardinals arrived early that day, earlier than protocol or urgency would demand. They exchanged no words, only glances drawn tight with unease. Their robes whispered against the stone, but even that was muted. The chapel of the choir stood untouched. It wasn't sealed by lock or decree, but by unspoken consensus. Behind its massive doors pulsed something faint and rhythmic, not a sound exactly, but a low vibration, the kind felt in the spine rather than heard. A curious deacon laid his palm against the wood. He recoiled moments later. Where his skin had met the surface, soot now streaked the ancient timber. There had been no fire. Elsewhere in the Vatican, other anomalies surfaced. In the Cortile del Belvedere, a statue of St. Michael had begun to weep. Not water, not blood, but something else. A black, oily substance with the scent of roses in electric storms. Photographers who documented the phenomenon noted an odd detail. In every image, the statue's eyes appeared open, yet in person, they remained sealed. The images were erased. Then they returned, deleted again, and yet they reappeared, this time with future timestamps. The Pope's private quarters remained eerily undisturbed. A seasoned Swiss guard posted at the door claimed he heard movement inside throughout the night, though it wasn't walking. He described it as pressure shifting across the walls, as if the air were testing the boundaries of the room. His words were careful, measured, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, fear without panic, as if resignation had already replaced understanding. He refused to remain on duty longer than his shift. In the depths of the apostolic archives, a manuscript reappeared, bound in black leather, marked only by a red ribbon and a date, September 23rd, 1978. No title, no classification. The head archivist, a woman renowned for her exactitude, claimed it hadn't existed the day before. She opened it, once, then closed it and sat immobile for 5 minutes before locking it away again. She offered no summary, no comment, only a single observation. Her hands afterwards smelled of iron and myrrh. Among the lay pilgrims housed in the outer lodgings, stories of shared dreams began to surface. Men and women awoke trembling, some crying, some silent. Each described a garden wrapped in flame, a faceless man holding a golden crozier, and an endless staircase spiraling toward an unseen summit. None had spoken to one another before. None could explain the tears they shed. One elderly woman, unable to sleep, wandered into St. Peter's Square at first light. She claimed she saw the obelisk pulse, once, then again, as if responding to a heartbeat not of this world. Her voice did not waver, but her hands shook as she pointed upward. The sky above Rome held no trace of dawn's warmth. It retained a strange hue, not gray, not blue, but something older, like ancient ash that remembered fire. No bells tolled, no birds called. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, and at the center of it all, just beyond the window of the apostolic palace, the flame still burned. It cast no shadow, offered no smoke, and consumed no wick. It simply existed, unflickering, unnerving, steady, light without fire, presence without heat, and it waited. No new edicts emerged from the Holy See, no public addresses, no subtle nods or veiled messages. The world beyond Vatican walls continued to turn, its people rushing and resting, praying and doubting. But across every screen, every newswire, every murmured conversation beneath stained glass or rain-soaked umbrellas, the same question whispered in every language. What does it mean when the one chosen to speak for heaven remains silent?